Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something literally mind-bending. We're taking a classic 1990s corporate management theory and using it to completely reimagine provincial independence. We're talking about taking dry organizational structures and turning them into a living, breathing blueprint for autonomy. Let's dive right in.
So you might be wondering, how on earth does a 90s corporate management book rewrite the rules of political independence? Well, we are exploring a fascinating text that takes Peter Senge's landmark business book, The Fifth Discipline, and applies it directly to Alberta's political landscape. Originally, Senge wrote about how corporations have to become adaptive learning organizations just to survive. But this source takes that exact framework and applies it neutrally to a geopolitical entity. It turns traditional political rebellion into systemic, structural evolution. It completely shifts the paradigm from, fighting an external enemy to just upgrading your own internal software.
Here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with the art of systems thinking. Look at the 5 core disciplines. Apply a new political lens, find the ultimate reset button, map out the anatomy of an independent province, and finally, wrap up with the unmasking process.
All right, let's start with Section 1, the art of systems thinking. This is really about understanding the operating system behind all of this.
Systems thinking proves a pretty radical idea. It's the structural design, not individual personalities, that dictates behavior within any system. Senge's work basically argues that if you put different people into the exact same flawed structure, well, they're going to produce the exact same flawed results. So to fix a problem, you absolutely have to stop looking at isolated snapshots of who to blame. Instead, start looking at the invisible circles of influence and the feedback loops that are actually running the show.
Have you ever noticed how quick fixes often just backfire entirely? This highlights one of Senge's core laws. Today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. The source document points to a system archetype called shifting the burden. It's this trap we fall into where we use short-term symptomatic fixes, like fighting endless legal battles or constantly renegotiating external agreements, that ultimately just make the underlying problem way worse over time. By constantly shifting the burden to external forces, we eventually turn into prisoners of our own reactive systems.
Moving on to Section 2, the 5 core disciplines. Think of this as the internal software for sovereign systems.
So, to escape that trap we just talked about, an organization actually needs to install new internal software. First up is systems thinking, which is the foundation we just covered. Second is personal mastery. This means holding the creative tension between where you currently are and your ultimate vision. Third, we have mental models, which requires rigorously testing deeply ingrained assumptions. Fourth, a shared vision. This creates a common frequency rather than relying on forced compliance. And finally, team learning, moving a group from a simple debate into a true dialogue. Notice how combining vision, deep reflection, and dialogue transforms any group from a reactive entity into a highly adaptive learning organization.
Section 3, a new political lens. Now we're applying this corporate theory directly to Alberta.
This represents a massive shift in mental models. We're moving away from the learned helplessness of blaming an external enemy, and instead moving toward building internal, undeniable competence. The old model relies on this assumption. We need federal permission to be a country, but the new model, it asserts that sovereignty is a function of local competence and utility. The idea is simple. If you build the utility, the sovereignty naturally follows.
Mastering these disciplines actually flips a reactive dependent state right into a proactive sovereign province. Just look at systems thinking. Instead of reacting to federal events, you're designing provincial structures. Or under shared vision, instead of being divided by partisan politics, the state becomes unified by a common frequency. It's a complete structural pivot from the mindset of a victimized subsystem to a fully empowered primary system. Let's look at Section 4, the ultimate reset button. This is about finding the exact leverage point to make it happen.
The document asks a great question. What is the single most effective reset button for a political independence movement? Well, systems thinking reveals a pretty hard truth here. Energy spent in constant federal legal battles is energy wasted. The true reset button is breaking that shifting the burden archetype. It means you stop fighting the center and you start focusing entirely on internal construction. Think about it. Every minute spent protesting external control is a minute you haven't spent building the local tax agency, the local police force, or the independent trade corridors that would make that external control completely irrelevant anyway.
You see, a traditional political reset relies on new leaders and louder rhetoric, but that just creates a temporary lift, which is almost always followed by the exact same systemic pushback. Senge's systems reset, on the other hand,
is all about redesigning internal loops. It builds a 10 to 20-year strategy of structural decoupling. You're basically out-engineering the old architecture of control rather than just fighting it in short, frustrating 4-year political cycles.
Which brings us to Section 5, Anatomy of an Independent Province. This is the biological blueprint, and it's super cool.
The source uses a medical concept called clinical ecology to explain this, and honestly, it's absolutely fascinating. Clinical ecology looks at how environmental stresses impact human health. When applied to a province, it suggests that a healthy geopolitical entity has to manage its own total load of environmental stress without relying on some federal filter. It needs to become a primary system designed to minimize external interference while maximizing internal vitality. And to do that, it needs its own biological organs.
So think of the revenue system as your circulatory system. A sovereign treasury that directly collects all taxes creates this closed, incredibly efficient circulatory loop for revenue, preventing any external leakage. On the flip side, energy and trade corridors act as the digestive system. By securing multiple redundant pathways to global markets, what the text calls strategic landlocking, the province processes and exchanges its valuable nutrients with the outside world entirely on its own terms.
Next up, we build the immune and cellular systems. Instead of relying on external dependencies like distant Supreme Courts or one-size-fits-all federal health mandates, the province builds a local firewall. Provincial appellate courts, local police, and decentralized health models basically form an immune system. They protect the unique values and specific terrain of the local population. It's genuinely incredible to see these dry political institutions mapped directly onto the anatomy of a living, breathing organism. A sovereign treasury is your circulatory system. Trade corridors handle digestion. Your provincial police and courts, that's the immune system protecting the boundaries. An independent reserve bank acts as the nervous system coordinating the frequency of value. And a local health model ensures the cellular health of the citizens. It's a really vivid, tangible way to conceptualize structural independence.
Finally, Section 6, the unmasking process, transitioning to a true community. Now, obviously, you don't just flip a switch to become a new organism. The source describes a process called institutional unmasking. Think of it kind of like an intense political elimination diet. It's a systematic diagnostic fast from federal services. By intentionally fasting from external interventions, the province actually figures out what drains its vitality versus what it truly needs. Through this unmasking, it sheds its dependencies and evolves into a lean, disciplined, and totally self-sufficient true community.
Which brings us to the core thesis of this whole explainer. If a province builds internal competence and acts as a self-sustaining organism, does the external architecture of control naturally fall away simply because it's obsolete? I'm going to leave you with that provocative thought experiment to chew on. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the unseen structures running the world around you.